must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show.
So when you're implementing this type of stuff, I mean, is the practical exam going to become obsolete now? Is there something, I mean, what goes on with the practical exam, the 5 exams that you take a week? Clinical education, is the CPI going to be obsolete? Give us an idea of kind of what your expectations is or what you see happening to these 3 main things that students dread in PT school.
Okay, so the 3 main things, if I heard you right, are practical exams, a whole bunch of written exams, and then Clin Ed.
The CPI, yeah.
The CPI. Okay. I think, let me start with practical exams. And I can talk about I can talk about examination or assessment broadly. Because I think that, it's probably, I'm just going to guess, but this would be the biggest philosophical shift, assessment, for PT education in a competency-based, learner-centered approach. And then I'll give you an example of something we're doing right now. And I'll let you know how that goes. But one of the things that you want to do is make sure that the learner is focused on learning, not just getting through an assessment, getting through an exam or a practical. And so to do that, we have all this science about how people learn, and then we have the realities of curriculum and how much time you have to do it. And sometimes those can be in conflict. But what you don't want is people cramming, if you will, or doing whatever they have to do to get through an exam at the expense of a more long-term learning, and sort of a focus on improvement over time. And so practical exams, in any health profession where you're going to go out and work with patients, you have a balance of learning and improvement, and then making sure you're competent to work with a human being, a patient, and that you're going to be safe and deliver good care to them. But I think that you could look at practical exams, if you will, as you mentioned, sometimes as a way to assess learning, have they learned, has a student learned, but other times as a way to help them learn. So to give them an experience that's as authentic as possible, and then give them feedback in specific areas where they can improve, and then create the space for them to actually go and do that. I'll give you an example. So one of the things we did in a first semester course this year, which is just wrapping up, which is a course that there are a number of practicals in, and they're sort of small practicals that are kind of technical, based on a lot of basic skills that we're used to early on in curriculum. And what we did was we put no limit on retaking them. We also shifted the responsibility back to the learner to decide when to retake if they didn't pass. And we gave them feedback on why they didn't pass. And then we let them go off and do, with help if they needed it, do the things that they thought they needed to be prepared to take it again. And then they let us know when they were ready, and they came and retook it. The other thing we did there was we created space in class. So I think another shift that can happen here around your question is to not think of teaching and assessment as always two different things, or to not think of teaching as class and assessment as not. And so we gave the students time in class during labs with the rubric to come up and say, hey, I'm ready to try this, to a lab assistant or a faculty member. And they could do it in a low stakes environment that did not affect their grade, and they could get immediate feedback on how they did. And I think that, I don't have the final numbers yet, but our preliminary report about halfway through the semester, scores were up and failures were down. Because you have to think, like, why is, if 70% is passing, is it okay, Stephanie, that you could only do 70% of the things on this practical when you go out with your patient? Or do we have some other standard? Do we want to say, here's the things you have to be able to do, and we're going to work with you until you can do that? I think that's a big shift. Because it requires a lot of trust between the faculty and the learner, that I want to know where you're making mistakes. I want you to show me. And I'm not going to penalize you too hard for us finding those out. I'm going to help you correct them.
It almost sounds like what you're describing is what we as clinical instructors strive to help our students achieve every day in the clinic.
Every day.
It sounds much more like a clinical education experience than it does a practical exam. I love the integration of the two. I think that that's really important. And I mean, I think that, like you said, everybody kind of learns a little bit differently, but it seems like the thing that always helps students become physical therapists is the actual clinical integration of the information.
Yeah, and then just for a minute, although cut me off if there's other things you want to cover. You mentioned written exams, and I'll just comment because it's on students' minds, because in most curricula, they can be fairly high stakes at different times. And students spend a lot of time preparing for those tests, and sometimes they don't have a lot of time, meaning they might have a really important test on a Monday and have another one on a Thursday, or have one unit that is ending and another unit beginning. And these structures can create sort of this, need for them to really focus on performance. In other words, preparing to get through the exam versus a long-term approach to learning. So we know we need to space out material. Things need to come back to them over and over again. And if it's something that you need to recall that over an extended period of time. Same thing if it's something that you need to be able to do or integrate. And so designing in a way that where they're not just taking a bunch of high stakes exams week in and week out is really important to move to this kind of approach, because you can't tell the learner, we want you to make mistakes, we want to give you all this feedback, but also we want you to still constantly take all these high stakes assessments, because they're going to make a rational decision and focus on the thing that could hurt them the most if they don't do well. So that has to balance. And then you mentioned this is like Clin Ed, but let me tell you how it could change. Right now we have a midterm and a final with the CPI, typically. And not everybody uses the CPI already, but a lot do. But what you might want are more data points in the clinical environment. So you might want a lot more short one-time assessments of where they're at right then, that day with that patient in that context, on taking a history or performing an exam and making a diagnosis, so that you as a program can aggregate all of this information over a lot more data points versus we have a midterm feedback and a final feedback. And oops, they don't match, and now we've got a problem. And so I hope that whether it's the CPI or not is to be determined. But I hope that whatever it is, we can provide more data points of feedback for the learner in the authentic environment as well.
Well, I think a good clinical instructor is always giving their student constant feedback about how they're performing. I know for my students at the end of the week, throughout the day, I'm giving them feedback, but at the end of the week, we kind of summarize everything that we talked about. And then we have a focus that we want to work on for the next week. So, I mean, I think a lot of clinical instructors probably teach like that. They don't just give feedback at the midterm and the final. So you're just kind of formalizing this process that they're of information that they're already providing with the student.
I would agree, and I would say not just formalizing it, but connecting it more to the program and the curriculum, so that ClinEd is not this sort of other thing that they go and do. It's part of the curriculum, and nobody even. So my goal would be that we don't even have the name ClinEd. We just have a curriculum, and these situated or authentic experiences are part of that. But we just connect it more. So that feedback that you're giving is also showing up for me or for Tammy Burles, who you know, that runs all this for us. So that we have this constant progression for the learner, and that you as the clinical instructor is really more a part of the faculty.
So this brings up an interesting question for you, Gammon. This is obviously a different way of learning. It's not It's not a traditional way of learning that, say, you would learn in undergrad. How does this change admission standards for physical therapy?
That's a great question. So we are actually looking at our admissions process in parallel with the curriculum renewal to make sure that those things are in alignment. I think it's going to help us to identify students who are struggling and students who are excelling in particular areas right from the start of the curriculum, because we're going to be able to map their performance, whether it's in these authentic experiences or in hands-on checkout where they're having their skills assessed, or on more formal assessments. They're all going to tie back to these domains and these competencies. And so imagine being able to see a dashboard as a student that shows you, okay, these are the areas that I'm supposed to be competent in by the time I'm done. Oh, I'm green in this one right now, but in this one I'm yellow, or this one I'm red. And being able to see how the multiple contributing elements from across all phases of the curriculum feed into that, so they can really hone in on what it is that they're doing well and what it is that they need to focus on. And then as faculty, being able to see that as well, and having that conversation with students along the course of their training to say, you're really strong in this area, but let's take a look at this other area and think about how we can enhance your performance there and give you more opportunities to learn within that domain. And being able to, share those same dashboards with clinical instructors. And so everybody's looking at the same data, and it's all triangulating to really help to guide that particular student in the way that they need. And I think that will help us to support students who come in with different backgrounds and different areas of strength to begin with versus areas where they need more work, and be able to facilitate learning for everyone coming in.
It sounds like this kind of curriculum allows more diversity within the profession. I know that's been a huge talking point with APTA. You're not just focusing on grade. I mean, I know WashU doesn't specifically just focus on grades, but there are a lot of PT programs that look at GPA, they look at GRE scores, they look at some of these more standardized measurements that we have. And from studies in diversity, we know that that's not necessarily the case for every qualified student who would be a great physical therapist. And I know Chad Cook has talked about in his lectures that he's given about, changing the admission requirements and trying to look for more leadership qualities in students versus just these data points like grade point average, et cetera. So it sounds like that this curriculum is better able to meet that need of diversity for healthcare providers. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Do you think that that's something that is that will help us achieve it, or what are some other things that we can maybe do with these curricular changes to achieve diversity in our profession?
I think that the shift towards this model allows you to create the structure to not only maybe admit differently, build a more diverse class, but it also hopefully allows you to put the supports in place so that everybody can succeed. So some of that you're asking about within the curriculum itself, but I also heard you asking about the admissions process, and you're right. I don't have hopefully in mid-January, I could even show you this, but it's because we're still discussing it. We created an admissions task force, and of course we have an admissions committee. That's one of the first things we started working on, because you can look at, if you're going to have a competency-based approach, why don't you also have a competency-based approach to admissions? You know, it would make no sense to keep a traditional model of using the metrics you just discussed and then saying, well, now that you're here, these things are less important. So what you can do is change to a model that focuses on, that still looks at some of those metrics, how you do in your undergraduate training, how you perform, but that also looks at how have you started to prepare yourselves to achieve these different competencies. An example might be, you know, do you demonstrate or an orientation towards leadership or towards service, or how can you show, you know, sort of the beginnings of some of the attributes around professionalism and ethics that we're interested in, and those things helping to guide who comes into the program instead of just GPAs, GREs, and things like that. So we've been working on that, and the admissions requirements or standards will then match the competency-based approach.
Well, we've talked a lot about your guys' experience with this transition. I know that this is kind of where the future of our DPT education is going. So what advice do you have to other program directors or institutions who are maybe interested in transitioning into a competency-based curriculum? What are some of the challenges that you foresee that they will face? And how can those institutions deal with those right away so that they can be successful with this?
I think that there are a number of challenges related to, well, one, you have to have the support, and what I mean by that is not only just the emotional and verbal support, but there has to be the financial support and the commitment from the program to do it. I mean, in fact, if you don't have that, I don't know if I would do it because it's resource intensive. This requires everybody spending a lot of time and a whole faculty coming together around a different approach. It's not something that I think you can just say, we're doing this now, and then ask people to implement it with all these different thoughts about what it means and what it might be. So you have to have support. There's going to be technology challenges that institutions will face. How will they track all of this data that we just talked about around assessment and student performance, and making sure those things talk? That's one of the most exciting things from ELP is some of the discussions they're having about it. How can we be able to look at these things, you know, from even pre-admissions through into practice? And so those things can be a challenge. You have to do faculty development, and I don't mean sort of a one-time workshop. You have to have ongoing faculty development conversation and bring in experts that can help the faculty, again, get this shared understanding of what it is they're going to be doing. Those are some of the biggest things. You know, and then imagine the institutional support you need. So whatever structure you're in, if you're a program in a department or a department within a school or a school within a college, you need support from higher level administration so that you can have the conversations around how to manage all these things on the back end. So if you're doing competency-based education, what's the registrar going to think? If you're providing more flexibility to the learner, what help do you need so that they can actually have that flexibility, versus somebody saying, where's this course grade? You have to have a course grade. So there's a lot of back end conversation and support needed to transition some of these things. There's good examples actually in undergraduate education. So I think more and more of our learners will come in used to this over time, over the next 10 years. There are a lot of universities that have transitioned their core curricula to a competency-based model where they are tracking towards competence in broad domains above the level of courses. And so as that grows in undergraduate education, especially in the liberal arts, I think our students will be more used to it, registrars will be more used to it, and other people in the university that we count on.
Do you have any challenges that you'd like to add to that, Gammon?
From my perspective, one of the concerns is faculty workload. As you're developing something new and preparing to launch it, knowing that you're going to continue to deliver what has been the current curriculum, because there will be students who have entered that curriculum and are working toward completion of it, while also layering the renewed curriculum on top of that. I think that's something that people need to be cognizant of, to figure out ways to protect people's time so that they do have the ability to do both, and or to bring new faculty aboard to manage that increase in workload, and not just assume that you can do it all with what you have available currently in terms of people's effort. And then I think, for a university that's interested in this, you don't have to sort of go whole hog all at once either. That, we've done some of these pilot examples like Steve mentioned, and I think, even small steps like that towards trying to, make the environment more learner-centered and facilitate long-term retention of information versus short-term performance are steps in the right direction.
I think you guys did a very good job outlining, defining what competency-based curriculum was, talking about how you've implemented it, talking about the challenges and the limitations to it. Obviously, this is kind of the future of DPT education. We always close our podcast with a standardized question, since we're talking about standardization as well. If you could change one aspect of healthcare education in physical therapy or in any other profession, what would you change and how would you change it?
If I could change one thing, so you're giving me free license here, it would be our societal commitment to the health professions education. And what I mean by that is, if you look at healthcare expenditures globally, the expenditures on education are maybe 2% of all of that, of what we spend on healthcare. I think that makes no sense. So I think we've set up a structure that makes it costly for people to enter the health professions. And I think that we're in a profession that gives so much back to society that we should value it more, and that we should that our governments should fund it more directly. There are some funding models, as you know, in medicine especially, but it's not enough, clearly. And so if I could change one thing, it would be this commitment to the health professions, and sort of thinking about it the other way around, instead of saying, why does it cost so much? But instead asking, why don't we support these people that are going into a caring profession, and that they're going to give the majority of their lives to helping all of these people? Think about how many people, Stephanie, you help on a daily basis, but how little commitment there is from our society towards you becoming this person. You're expected to do it as an individual because you're expected to get all these individual returns. And you do get individual returns. We make a high wage if you look at the national medians in this country. But there's not enough commitment to the development of health professionals from our society.
What about you, Gammon?
I think my answer is in the same vein. I see talented students who I think could really contribute in the health professions career, particularly in something other than medicine specifically, but I think that we are falling behind in physical therapy and other health professions relative to physician training in terms of the financial support that is available to help people pursue these professions. And, there have been a number of big announcements at major universities about major investments in MD training, made possible through gifts from donors, for example, where, some universities now, their MD training is tuition free. And so, trying to move physical therapy and other health professions in that direction, at least where the financial picture is not so disparate between training to be a physician and training in other health professions that it drives people exclusively in that direction to the detriment of the other careers. Because I think it's important that we continue to attract top quality students, and in particular, students from diverse backgrounds, including diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. So if we, slant the balance so dramatically that the only financially viable solution is to go with training to be a physician, I think the other health professions are going to experience a real loss and be at a disadvantage. So I think trying to advocate on behalf of the non-physician professions within this realm of investment would be my push.
I love how you guys are thinking about this in the sense of how can we support these people more. I think that, as society, we're so burdened with all this financial debt in training to be a healthcare professional, whether it be a physician, a physical therapist, or a physical therapist, a PT, physician assistant. But I think, it's true. We used to value education, I think, a lot more in this country than we do now. And I think that that's just because resources are so low. So hopefully we can get our lawmakers to support those choices that you guys have highlighted today. Well, I know that a lot of our listeners are going to probably have questions for you, especially since, Steve, you're looking to disseminate this topic. I'm sure that our listeners can help you with that. So where and how can people contact either of you if they have any questions, either by social media or email or snail mail?
Email is the best way to reach me.
What about you, Steve?
Yeah, my email, of course, and then I'm on Twitter at Doc Ambler is also another way.
And we'll have both Gammon and Steve's emails in the show notes, so you can look for those if you're interested in contacting them. Thanks again for joining us, you guys. It was a wonderful conversation. I hope that our listeners learned a lot more about competency-based curriculums. And thank you to our listeners for listening to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available on our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, Extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.